Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's lecture. By now, you've set some goals. You've probably gotten your feedback by now on those goals, and you're ready to start putting them into practice. Well, today we're going to talk about cognitive wellness, and this week is actually the first lecture that's going to focus on a single domain of well being. And so we hope that while we talk about this domain, you can find little pieces of these different concepts and apply them to your life immediately. Now remember, as it's been the case so far this semester, we're going to try and add to what the book has already talked about. So to do your best on your quiz this week, make sure you both study this lecture as well as the book chapter. Sound good? Okay, let's get started. So here's today's plan. Overall, I want to make it clear to everybody that with a few exceptions, you have a lot of control over your attitude or your mindset. So we can take a look at those attitudes and mindsets to see how they influence our life. For instance, someone who always seems to find the positives or the silver linings in situations might be a more pleasant person to be around than someone who always seems to find something wrong or something negative in every situation. Once we've established that everyone has a certain level of control over their thinking, we can talk about how we learn and how learning changes our attitudes and our abilities. And so when we know that we can control our thoughts and that learning and thinking changes over time, we can start to think about how it applies to our health and well-being. Does that sound good? All right, well, let's jump in. So let's anchor this content with an overview of how your thoughts connect to your health. The diagram here shows how we perceive our environment. When we see, hear, or otherwise experience an event, we first have to sense it. So let's pretend that we're taking a walk and all of a sudden we come across a bear. If we have poor eyesight, we would never recognize that bear that we have right in front of us. Now, if we weren't able to sense it at all, we wouldn't be able to hear its growls, we wouldn't be able to smell it, etc. We would simply stumble right into the bear and we would have a bad situation on our hands. But perceiving this bear is only one step in our thinking or thought process. The second portion is interpreting those sensations. With the bear, most of us would perceive the bear as a significant threat, but other people, like the grizzly man, who lived with bears for years, wouldn't be scared. Why? Because we're going to interpret the threat of that bear differently. The same would go for Steve Irwin, the late crocodile hunter, as he would approach extremely dangerous animals without much fear, where the rest of us would almost have certainly panicked. So here's another example. You might see the bear in the woods and be scared, but if you saw that same bear in the zoo, you wouldn't be scared, because you'd be interpreting those sights very differently. In all of these different situations, our perceptions or thoughts play a huge role. If we are scared but we tell ourselves to remain calm, using like a form of self-talk, we might be able to keep our composure in a situation versus being scared and telling ourselves to panic. Some of us might interpret that situation one way, where somebody else can interpret that same situation very differently. And so all those little variations in our thought process can make the difference in jumping on the animal like the crocodile hunter would, or just running away. One of the things that also changes how we act is our knowledge. So let's say if we don't know how to act around a crocodile, we might have a blind sense of fear. Where Steve Irwin, who had an incredible knowledge of the animal, would be alert, but he would understand the animal so well that he knew how to act around them. And so with those examples in mind, think about how our thoughts or our perceptions directly affect our body. It's easy to see how when we are scared, our heart rate can beat faster or our body tenses up and prepares for either fight or flight, versus when we think nothing is wrong and our body remains much more at ease and in the moment. This is how constant stress or anxiety can cause different pains in our body, like stomach aches and other very physical symptoms, simply from certain thoughts or brain activity. So let's talk about this and expand it a little bit more. Alright, so let's challenge some of those cognitive processes. And let's use this exercise to do it. Try drawing these 9 dots on your paper, just like this in a 3 by 3 grid. Now, without picking up your pencil, can you connect all of these dots using only 4 straight lines? It's definitely possible, and many of you might have already done this. If you've already solved the puzzle with 4 lines, can you do it in 3? Maybe even 2? It's even possible for someone to solve this with just one single line. Now keep this puzzle in mind while we go through the rest of the content, and we'll come back to the solution later on. So while you think about that puzzle, we'll talk a little bit more about critical thinking. And what we're talking about is asking everyone to think about their own thought processes. This is called metacognition. For instance, when do you seem to be the most alert? What types of activities are engaging for you? What steps do you usually take when you try to solve a problem? We all have patterns that we tend to use when we think about puzzles or problems or other random situations in our day to day life. The trick is paying attention to how we operate and learning about what those patterns are. Now, it's only when we learn about those patterns that we can make a meaningful and intentional change. One area to start would be paying attention to the differences between active versus passive thinking. Have you ever been reading a book, gotten to the bottom of the page, and suddenly realized you didn't remember any of the information you just read? You just kind of scanned the words and read them, but nothing stuck? That's a great example of passive reading. Another might be watching TV, and even though you don't really like what's on TV, you're too tired to change the channel, so you just kind of watch it anyway. That's being passive. We tend to be passive when we're stressed out or tired. So we do this with reading, TV, making decisions with friends, where sometimes you might just give up and concede and do whatever everybody else wants to do, even if it isn't your favorite activity. And it's all because making decisions or being active takes psychic or like physical energy. When we're tired, we don't feel like we have the energy. We tend to become much more passive and much less active. Now let's talk about how these thoughts or behaviors develop over time. So picture your thoughts as a path. If you hadn't had to use a certain part of your brain before, certain thoughts could be like walking through a field of tall grass for the first time, where there's no path, like in the top photo here. This could apply when learning how to play a new instrument, speak a new language, learn about a new culture, or any new activity. Think about the first time you tried something new, and think about how you had to really struggle and force yourself through that tall grass in order to learn the task. Now, if you walk that same path again and again, or you practice that skill or thought again and again, the path becomes more worn, like in the second photo down. Over time, the path becomes stronger and wider, turning into one that may be able to hold multiple different people or maybe you can do multiple different tasks. Over time, the pathway turns into a small road that ends up becoming a highway. This is how the connections with the neurons in our brain develop. Have you ever heard the adage, if you don't use it, you lose it? Well, we are born with many neurons over time, and the ones that we use consistently are the ones that develop stronger connections and they become faster and more efficient, where the ones we don't use wither away and become weaker. It's the same place that developed the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, thanks to the science of neuroplasticity, we know that we can reestablish those weak connections and build new skills, but we have to spend time walking through that tall grass and creating a new path or new connection that becomes stronger over time. So this is essential to our cognitive health. It helps us avoid cognitive degeneration that's famous for occurring in older adults. But it's not exactly saying that we can cure Alzheimer's by studying new things and new tasks. You can simply help reduce your risk and stay mentally sharp by engaging in new tasks and thoughtfully learning about them. The other benefit is that these paths will strengthen over time. And so the more you travel those roads, you can start traveling them faster and faster. It not only helps you get to where you were originally going or what you're originally learning, but it helps you explore even different areas over time. So maybe you take the highway so far, then you turn off into a new little subset of that activity, and you'll start learning newer, more complicated things with greater ease. So let's think about how you have control over your own mindset. When you encounter something new and you get confused, you can have two very different attitudes about the topic. You can think that learning about the topic is impossible, and if that you were supposed to know it, you would already have that kind of pathway for it in your brain. That's considered a fixed mindset. Individuals with this mindset, when they struggle with something, believe they are simply not good at it and assume that they're not going to get any better. The opposite of a fixed mindset is a growth mindset. Individuals with this mindset might not do well initially, but they understand that they can continue to carve that new path in their brains. And over time, with practice, they'll get better at it. You might be able to think of a really tough class you've taken before and how you thought to yourself, man, I'll never understand this. That would be an example of a fixed mindset versus, man, I need to spend more time working on this and eventually I'll get it, which is a growth mindset. Sometimes we have combinations of these two different attitudes, and it's very common to at first feel like you're never going to understand it, but after your initial reaction, you go back and continue working. You might also think of a time where maybe you just had to take a break and calm down and relax before going back and trying some more. We take those breaks because it's very stressful for us when we don't do well. If we have a fixed mindset, we might get very frustrated, beat ourselves up, and say very negative things to ourselves when things don't go our way. Think about how those negative messages can make someone feel pretty bad. Now, what do we usually tell other people when we see them beating themselves up? We might say things like, "You'll get it, keep trying, it'll get easier," etc. We usually tell people to have a growth mindset, but when we think about our own thinking, we often slide into a fixed mindset. So, is there a way that we can be intentional and tell yourself to have a more growth mindset towards everything? Telling yourself that when you approach something new that you might not be good at it right away, but you can learn about it, and instead of simply accepting or rejecting it, you can stick with it and see where it goes. That's the kind of control that we have towards our thinking, and it can affect our mindsets towards classes, towards new people, topics, just life in general. So here's a diagram by Carol Dweck that helps explain what I mean. On the left is a fixed mindset. You can follow the thoughts from top to bottom and see how we respond if we have this attitude. So if we have a thought and we're challenged by it, a fixed mindset is going to lead us to avoiding that challenge. Think about a physical challenge, like if you're walking down the road and all of a sudden there's a huge hole or maybe a tree that's blocking your path. A fixed mindset is going to tell us that there's nothing we can do to cross and we simply need to find another way. And now, if we're thinking about a topic and can't avoid the challenge or we can't avoid that blockage, we might simply give up and say there's nothing we can do, which means a fixed mindset is tied to giving up more easily. That ties to how much effort we're going to be willing to put into activity, because if we don't believe we can do it, we're not going to try very hard to get something done. So pay attention to how you respond to different challenges, because if you have a fixed mindset in that moment and you don't think you can do something, you're not very likely to put in much effort into the work. For instance, if you simply don't think you can learn a topic, you'll just give up on the idea and tell yourself you can't do it. We would also tend to ignore any feedback from our effort. For instance, Thomas Edison failed many times to create a light bulb, and if he had a fixed mindset, he would not have learned from each of his failures in order to improve on his design. He would have been upset, frustrated, and believed that light bulbs were just never supposed to be invented. He might also get really bitter towards other inventors, like Nikola Tesla, whenever they had a breakthrough or did something well or something that he failed at. For instance, think about class. And when you're studying very hard and you can't quite seem to figure out a topic, but your classmate has no problem and gets a perfect score on all the coursework, you might actually get a little bitter towards that classmate for being such a show off. But in the end, it was a simple decision that with a fixed mindset, you simply didn't have the ability to do something, so you put in little effort and gave up when you hit any of those obstacles, and especially didn't take the time to learn from those obstacles and why you were struggling, which eventually led to you giving up. Now, this is all from a simple mindset, and that's why it's so important to tell yourself or to tell others to have encouraging phrases that promote growth. And so, when we experience challenges from a growth mindset, we stop and examine the different obstacles, knowing that we're going to overcome it and understanding that it's just a matter of how we're going to overcome it. And when we seek that understanding, we end up putting in more effort into finding a solution, which leads us to learn from those setbacks and criticisms, eventually leading us to be successful. So, not only can a decision change how our body physically responds, it can put you on a path to accepting new risks, uh, being willing to accept stronger challenges, and all the while you're going to have this attitude that you're going to succeed. It's a ton of information, and I bet you wouldn't have thought that so much of this can come from having a simple change in attitude. Am I right? And so all that research led to a model of how we think. Perry's model was developed using traditional college students, which means it would directly apply to many of you watching this lecture, and might also find a lot of similarities with the general population. The theory is well regarded and it's very similar to Bloom's taxonomy. In general, it's going to emphasize growth that has to occur in our thinking, very similar to the analogy of how those paths have to grow and develop in our brain. They argue it's going to take time to develop those paths, and each new activity needs to have its own path. Meaning, I could be an expert in counseling or psychology, but if I want to go move into business finance, I'm going to have to start over and carve a brand new path. The stages of the model are listed on the right, and we're going to talk about each one separately. But essentially, it's a pattern of growing from dualistic thinking into being more multiplistic and eventually relativistic before committing to a certain overall style of thinking. So let's talk a few minutes about each of these and see if you can apply some of these to your own thought processes. So in stage one of Perry's model is dualistic thinking. This is a stage where we simply just need to know what the right answer is and what the wrong answer is. So have you ever been in a class and felt like all I need to know is what the right answer is for the test? That's an example of this stage. Often we feel this way when we're new to something or we get confused. We can be overwhelmed and just need to know what's going to be on the test or what we're supposed to put down if we're asked. This could also be the same in relationships with other people when we say, just tell me what you want, or just tell me what I'm supposed to do or say. In this stage, we don't realize that there might be multiple different answers for a problem, like different ways to write a response to an essay question. It isn't until we start learning about the situation and kind of developing greater depth of knowledge for a topic that we start to transition to the next stage where we realize that there's a little bit of wiggle room in each of these situations, and there might not necessarily be one single right answer. So that transition is what's going to lead us to stage two of Perry's model, or multiplistic thinking. This is a stage where we have some understanding and experience with a task. We know that there are multiple different ways to do something, but we still have that lingering feeling that one is better than the rest. That leads us oftentimes to go with our gut and we choose which option we think is best. Now, sometimes that works well, like in an essay question when you have time to explain your rationale, but in areas like accounting or medicine, when we have to have a much more precise answer and there's much smaller room for error, we need to be much more certain in what we are doing. That's when we start transitioning back out of this stage. It's also when being or becoming an expert in finance or medicine takes you such a long time because you have to stop and develop all these different pathways over time. And that makes it more than just a gut decision. In this transitionary phase, we start recognizing that although multiple options exist, if we find more information about the topic, we would be able to make a much more informed decision. And that's what leads us to stage three, or relativistic thinking. That's when all of our experience with a topic pays off. We might approach a situation and understand that there are multiple outcomes, but in this stage, we can start weighing all of the different consequences of those potential decisions. It's when we start evaluating all of our different sources of information for a decision and factor in things like somebody else's feelings or what our values say we're supposed to do. Like our doctor from the previous example, they would want to be able to identify the issue with a patient, understand the research and the risks of multiple different ways to treat them, and decide what their skills and experience suggest they should do. Then they would go ahead and explain this to the patient, and they collaboratively would make a decision that minimizes the risks and best approaches the main issue. All of these different moving parts start coming together and make a very well informed decision that everybody feels most comfortable with. It is only after we've gone through the past few processes a few times and started to learn how do we incorporate all of these different pieces do we start to transition to the final stage of Perry's model. And that's when we end up in stage four, or the commitment stage. Here's where we know how we're going to integrate all this different information and make a decision. For instance, that doctor might trust the research around a given topic and give it much more weight in their own decision making than their personal values or their gut feelings. Maybe you think the research is good, but you don't necessarily think it applies to individuals in real life. So you put more weight into a specific decision or those gut instincts, etc. When you know this about yourself, you can make a commitment to your approach towards a topic. Now stop and take a minute to think about a situation where you can see yourself in one of these stages. What is that specific situation? Is it a class? Is it a situation with another person or a friend? At what stage are you in that situation? Are you comfortable in that stage, or are you wishing there was like something more that you can do for your thought process? What things would you need to take the next step? Stopping and thinking about all of these things while you're in a given situation can give you more control over what you do and why you do it. This makes you much more active rather than passively just letting things happen to and around you. So let's take a little time to talk about what prevents that growth from occurring. Many times we have irrational beliefs that can disrupt this whole system. These are different thoughts that usually put us on an unproductive path. For instance, we can distort reality when we think things will never get better, or everybody feels a certain way about me. Those are thoughts that we cannot possibly have the evidence for because we cannot see the future, nor can we read everyone's mind. They're illogical thoughts that cause us stress, and that stress response in our body. It can also put us in a fixed mindset that leads to much more negative outcomes. This is especially true when thinking about yourself and your wellness. Think about the goals that you've set for yourself. What do you or others often say when they're trying to achieve those goals? They might resemble some of those negative thoughts that we talked about with the fixed mindset when we reviewed that graph. Think about what you could tell yourself or tell other people when those little irrational thoughts sneak into your head. You can work to replace them with an ideal thought that is much more rational, fair, and logical. The trick is simply being aware that those thoughts are occurring and then actively replacing them, making those irrational beliefs unwelcome. So over time, you'll make that a habit and you won't even have to think about it. You'll just actively replace negative thoughts with more positive ones, and your mind will just do that automatically for you. So, what if I told you to picture a pink elephant? And you can have this picture in your mind. Maybe it's at the circus, the zoo, maybe it's out in the wild, but you have a pink elephant in front of you, and you're kind of struck by how odd a pink elephant appears. Now, if I tell you, stop picturing a pink elephant, and I gave you a moment, odds are you're still thinking about this pink elephant. That didn't do anything to remove that thought from your mind. I can replace it with, now picture a green giraffe. And think about it. Is it a light green giraffe with dark green spots? Maybe it's a dark green giraffe with light green spots. Maybe it's all one shade of green. When I replace that thought and I put the green giraffe in your mind instead of the elephant, you'll forget about the pink elephant. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about replacing these irrational beliefs. And over time, it becomes much more automatic. Now, here on this slide is a list of these different irrational beliefs that Albert Ellis came up with. His research led to a really long list of irrational beliefs that people often tell themselves. And so it's not just something he saw once or twice, it's something that he found consistently in his research. You're welcome to check out his book, A Guide to Rational Living, but here are a few of his ideas. Now keep in mind, we're not trying to paint the world with rainbows and look at things through rose-colored lenses, but we need to be much more fair and rational with our thought processes. And the research says that we just don't have enough room for thoughts like these if we want to be happy and healthy. Now, we're going to move on, but feel free to pause the lecture here and read these more carefully if you'd like. So, in my experience, one of the really practical tools I use is I keep in mind this short list of words. So, anytime I'm thinking in absolute terms, I can be pretty certain that I'm making a pretty big assumption about the situation or a topic. Anytime I say I must or I have to do this, or every time I do this, this happens, and always this or always that, I'm certain that I'm making some kind of assumption that's irrational. I need to replace that thought. So feel free to pause this and write these down if you'd like, but we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right, so I think I've kind of mentioned this, but I want to take a moment to talk about it much more directly. The main point in talking about all the dirty and smelly irrational thoughts you have is that you can change them. We talked about how you're in control and you have the ability to choose your mindset. You can choose to see the bad in a situation or the good. Now, the choice is yours, but the first step is being aware that something is happening. Some of us have these irrational beliefs or negative mindsets and never consciously choose to have them. For instance, if I asked you if you wanted to be negative or have such a fixed mindset about something, you might say, "Yeah, being negative is great, I really enjoy it." But it's more likely that you would say, "No, not really. I feel like I'm kind of down on myself all the time." And you never really made a conscious decision to think that way. So pay attention to how you react and think, and then make a choice about whether or not that's the way you want to live. Those changes have the ability to eliminate negative thoughts and then replace them with those happier ones. And over time, those positive, rational thoughts become a habit. And we know that when we stay more positive, we'll be much less stressed, and that leads to better functioning immune system, greater levels of happiness, and higher levels of life satisfaction. All right, so that's it. That's how your thoughts can influence your mood as well as your physical well being. Here's the solution to the dot puzzle for all those who chose to work on it. The main assumption that many people make when attempting this puzzle is that you cannot extend your lines outside of the box. But no one ever said that. So keep that in mind. How many rules do you just kind of make up and follow day to day versus how many times someone has actually said, this is what needs to happen versus that? Don't put artificial limits around your thinking and your abilities. Be willing to go outside the box and try new things. I hope today's lecture was helpful and it helped you push your thinking outside of that box and gave you some good tips and tricks for recognizing what your thought process might look like and how you can make much more positive changes towards improving your cognitive well being. Good luck on the quiz this week, and I look forward to talking about our next topic.